for the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of The Open Highway. I'm your host, Eric Erickson. Thank you for joining us. A great show that we're going to have today with Matthew Newbauer. We're going to talk about policing and the modern state of law enforcement. Where do we go from here? First of all, let's do a little housekeeping. Again, this is the first episode, and I've been conducting a few interviews and starting to put the show together, and one thing I'm already noticing is this show is evolving, and I think that's an exciting thing. I think too often we get stuck in the mud, and as people, as society, conversationally. And I think it's great that over time, not only is this show going to evolve, but I will evolve. And that's why I'm doing this. And I hope everyone who listens evolves a little bit, questions their own attitudes, questions the way that they look at the world, because that's what it's about. I mean, how many times have we had that conversation about a politician and they said, well, they changed their views. Well, you're supposed to change your views. You're supposed to become a more advanced person. You're supposed to take in what you've learned and reassess and reevaluate the way you look at the world. So that's what not only is this show about having conversations, about discussing topics, but actually evolving. And I see the show evolving. I see the way it's presented evolving. I see myself evolving. And maybe that's a little bit selfish. Maybe this show's about me. But you know what? It's my show. And so that's the way it is. So I'm really excited about having these conversations and bringing them to you. And I'm curious about your feedback. So please, after you listen to the show, listen to the end, and we'll have some information about how to contact if you have ideas for conversations, if you like it, if you don't. I'm used to the hate emails. That's nothing new for me. But I'm really excited about this. It's going to be a great journey. So thanks for joining me on this. So we're going to take care of a couple things and be back with Matthew Newbauer and talk about policing. Hey everyone, Eric here. Did you know that Viking Dog Entertainment has our very own apparel line? Motivational shirts, including our mantra, Never Doubt Your Power, which are not only a fun, inspirational line of clothing, but also give back. A portion of the proceeds of each of these motivational shirts are donated to wolf rescue organizations. And what's more, we have a special line of wolf-related shirts that provide 100% of their proceeds to wolf rescue. You can choose from a number of designs including Save the Wolves, Leader of the Pack, or I Love Wolves. And every penny of profit from these shirts will be donated directly to Wolf Rescue. So visit thevikingdogstore.com and get your shirts today. Perfect for the gym or just wearing on a daily basis, we have men's, women's, and even shirts for kids. Motivate your workout and help us help save these amazing animals. thevikingdogstore.com.
There's renewed anger in the United States over police violence. Footage has emerged of a 75-year-old demonstrator protesting the death of George Floyd being pushed to the ground by officers.
We begin with several Detroit police officers now under investigation.
3 police officers are on trial in St. Louis accused of brutally beating one of their own.
Viral incidents like these caught on camera over the years. Kindling for the fire burning across America this morning as protests continue.
Let's begin this bulletin by bringing you the latest from the United States, where protests have erupted over police brutality. But ironically, the same police brutality is now being showcased at demonstrations protesting the very same.
The investigation stems from an incident early yesterday morning in Greektown. The first video is shocking, showing a Detroit police officer punching a man in the face and the man falling to the pavement.
The chief of police in Aurora, Colorado is apologizing after a brutal arrest captured on the body cameras of two officers.
The state of Washington has just enacted a dozen police reform laws following nearly a year of nationwide protest over police brutality.
Growing calls across the nation to defund the police. But what does that mean? What could it look like? And will it make our communities safer?
So, joining us today is Matthew Newbauer. Matthew is a retired police detective who is now very involved in the conversation about police reform and knows a lot about the history of policing in America and how we got to this point. And you've been living under a rock if you have not only not known about what's gone on in the United States in the last couple of years as far as the conversation about policing, but it's time to have that conversation. And I'm really excited that Matthew is joining us today. So, Matt, thanks for joining me today. I've really been looking forward to this because policing is a non-controversial topic, and we should actually not be able to have any problems with this. Can you just really quickly tell me a bit about yourself, what your background, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate being asked to participate in this conversation. I think it's an important conversation and one that I think behooves us all to have, no matter where we are in society, whether we're in public service, in the private sector, or just a citizen of a local community. I think it's important to have. So for me, I have an interesting background. I'm actually third generation law enforcement. My grandmother was she was a sheriff's deputy and then a police detective in South Carolina in the 60s through the early 80s. And after that, my father, after spending a career in the Coast Guard, he started working for the newly formed Department of Homeland Security at the time and became a federal agent with the Department of Homeland Security, where he still works now in senior management. And for me, I started my law enforcement career very early, a month after I turned 18, actually, where by law, without being a sworn law enforcement official, I wouldn't have been able to carry a concealed weapon because of my age. The age is 21. So I started with a very small sheriff's department in Virginia. And I eventually, in that role, I worked I supervised the workforce inmates, the trustee inmates that are given responsibilities within the jail. And then I also worked as a corrections officer inside of a city jail. I did that for a bit, and then I actually left to finish a degree that I was pursuing and went to England and worked in England for 2.5 years outside of law enforcement, and then came back and I joined a small police department, did very well there. And then I ended up moving to a larger police department where I worked up until June of this year. And I started off as most officers do. I started off as a patrol officer. And then I moved into our community engagement section. And then after our community engagement section, I moved into investigations, where I specialized in chronic child abuse, sexual abuse, molestation, adult rape. And I ended up overseeing the domestic violence calls for service of the entire police department that I worked for, some 900 sworn officers, about 1,200 personnel altogether. And from there, I was put on a task force to investigate financial crimes. And I worked with the U.S. Secret Service. I was federally sworn on this federal task force, working, investigating cyber crimes and financial crimes. And that's where I worked up until I decided that I was going to retire early, actually. And so I'm actually not going to collect a retirement for a few more years, but it was the right time for me to leave and to move on to what's next. But I am considered retired, and that was sort of my journey throughout all different types of jobs within sort of like the larger area of law enforcement.
So you really didn't do much with your career.
Very boring, very boring.
Would you describe yourself as being involved in police reform?
Sure. So within my career at the last police department that I spent the most time at, I was in our community engagement section during the events that occurred in Ferguson, Missouri. And so my job prior to that was to reach out to different groups within the county that I worked for, different minority groups, different groups that represented different parts of the community that we served. And then once the events of Ferguson became widely publicized, and then later on was a lot closer to home, just one state over, the riots in Baltimore, that my role within our community engagement section began to be trying to answer these very important questions that members of our community had, because they were watching these things happening on the news, and there really wasn't wide coverage as detailed and really as pointed as it was at that time. That hadn't happened for a while, really, since the Rodney King incidents in California in the early 90s. So I started to become confronted with a lot of these questions, and I started asking myself personally, wow, well, what is my role within this, and what is my department doing to make sure that we're serving our community?
And I'll bet these weren't just questions. Like I'm guessing these were passionate pleas coming from
Absolutely.
very emotional places, very probably yelled a few times. I mean,
yeah, there were many times where it got very contentious. But I kept on during those times. I kept on reminding myself of the history of policing in the United States and what that meant for members of the community that felt like they were being underserved, or even felt like they were being singled out among the community for police enforcement. The history of policing in the United States, it's rife with systemic discrimination and racism. And in order to look at reform for the future, really the most important thing is to, in my opinion, is to be able to look back and to see where we came from. And so in my department, I ended up being put on a committee for police reform called the Fair and Impartial Policing Committee. And I was on that board, as well as a few other people within the police department and within other area agencies in the county that I worked for. The county that I worked for was what's called majority minority. So over 50% of the population that we served in that county were considered people of color. So we wanted to make sure that we were representing the county, and many people within the county that were employees of the county were people of color. And there was a very diverse group put on this committee to start examining, how are we responding to these questions that people in our community are having? What are we doing? What are our policies? And how does that explicitly or implicitly affect the people that we are serving? And so we ended up going through quite a bit of training from outside organizations that specialized in the social science research of implicit bias and discrimination and the history of systemic issues within our criminal justice system. And I very quickly was given an education in the background of law enforcement in our country, the background of local governments and how local governments related to people of color within their community, and really just how long things went unchecked until very relatively recently in American history, in terms of governments serving or not serving the people of color within their community.
And
I
think it'd be fair to say, though, that the racial aspect of policing is huge. It's absolutely one of the largest issues, the issue of systemic racism. I would say, and I can say this from personal experience, I used to be a reporter with the Chicago Tribune City News Service, and my office was in police headquarters. So I saw a lot. And I know while I was there, and I hope they've changed, but while I was there, one of the things was, for example, domestic violence. Domestic violence was seen as a second or third tier crime. And what that would mean is response time was not a priority. Arrest was not a priority. Restraining orders were not a priority. And there were tales that went around of horrible things that happened because the police would not respond, because to them it was like, it was not as important. And if there's an overall attitude, whether it's race or domestic violence toward women or whatever it is, they're going to feed each other. And it's going to create a problem in the entire department or all of law enforcement. So it really seems like it's this holistic issue where not everything is, you take out one piece, is going to affect something else, and it's going to affect this and that. So it's almost as if there needs to be a top-down overhaul. There really needs to be a looking at the entire problem. Just picking and choosing what to fix, it's patching the dam. It's really not fixing the overall problem.
I absolutely agree with you, because I think that's the only way to treat the actual illness and not just symptoms of the illness, as it were. So let's take domestic violence for example. So one thing that I hear from a lot of police officers, I also was a trainer. I taught crisis intervention training for officers all over Northern Virginia, the DC area. I taught police response to mental health calls for service, recognizing implicit biases, as well as things like control tactics and investigations and whatnot. So I've trained a lot of police officers, and many police officers that I've talked to, especially ones that are younger in their career, I hear back, oh, well, I would never be racist or discriminatory against somebody. Like, no, I got into this job to help people. All I do is enforce the laws that are on the books. And if they don't like that, then, that's their problem. And so I think a holistic approach would be policy reform from the top up. So let's talk about domestic violence, for example. You're absolutely right. If you go back and you look at the statistics of domestic violence, as well as serious bodily injury and deaths resulting from domestic violence, you'll see that there is a marked decrease after the 1994 Violence Against Women's Act was passed by U.S. Congress. After that, it strongly encouraged for there to be mandatory arrests made when when there was probable cause to believe a predominant aggressor of a domestic violence incident assaulted another person. Before, police were given a very wide degree of latitude or discretion to respond to those, and many times they were looked at as family matters. And after the Violence Against Women's Act was passed, and there was more training and there was more oversight, and there was actually a policy and a law to point to, we see a marked decrease in those domestic violence, serious bodily injury, and death cases. And it goes beyond just say domestic violence. I mean, if you look at the history of our country's laws, it's important to remember that police have been the enforcement arm of local governments, local police, since their inception in the 1830s, when Boston made their own, the first sort of wide city police department. And let's look back at the laws. For example, looking at Loving v. Virginia, where officers in Virginia found out that a interracial couple had been married in Washington, D.C., but lived in Virginia, a segregationist state where that was illegal. They went into the house in the middle of the night and took them out. And they were just following the law. That's what was on the books at the time. That was completely legal, and that's where we get our Supreme Court precedent from. Let's fast forward to 2003. Lawrence v. Texas was a Supreme Court decision where there was a gay couple that, again, police came into their house in the middle of the night and arrested them for sodomy because in Texas, up until that time, up until 2003, when it was considered a violation of civil rights, that was illegal. That was on the books. The police officers weren't breaking any laws, quote unquote, at that point, all the way up to stop and frisk in New York City, which was again found to be a violation of civil rights by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in 2013. Very recent history where NYPD cops would stop and frisk people. That's a Fourth Amendment right issue there, a right against unreasonable searches and seizures based on nothing except, this guy was, in this neighborhood at 2:00 in the morning. That's suspicious to me. So the argument that officers are just enforcing what's on the books, it's an argument that honestly, I think holds a little bit of weight. I think that it's really the policy from the top up that really has to be changed in order to see real difference made.
But so I'm gonna play devil's advocate a little bit. That's the I was only following orders argument. And I think
Correct.
that we like to believe that a police officer is held to a higher standard, whatever that is, and that they will push back against something that they see is not correct. But that's a dangerous argument because it could go either way. They might see a law that is just as not being just, and in their morality, they shouldn't have to enforce it. I mean, that's a very dangerous area to start getting into.
Absolutely.
By doing that. But yeah, it's that argument that we believe they should be held to a higher majority, but who just higher authority, but who is that authority? Or what I believe that authority is going to be different than you versus somebody else. And then we have a whole big problem by that. So, I mean, that's why we're a nation of laws. And if we don't like the laws need to be changed. That's the basis of what we are.
And I think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing the common citizen of a local community actually starting to be actively involved in policy reform, advocating for policy reform and for legal reform in their community and in their state.
Yeah.
Over the past 20 months, there have been more police reform laws passed throughout the 50 states than at any other time in history in the past 20 months. So I think people are doing that.
That wasn't that. I mean, when you think about it, isn't that really the basis of the argument in the George Floyd case? Was having his knee on the neck. He was saying that's the rule. That's what I was taught. I was only following what the law allowed me to do. I didn't do anything wrong. So there's that area. There's that argument.
Yeah.
Like, shouldn't he have known that was wrong and taken a stand?
Absolutely right. And that's when it's important to realize that there are right around 18,000 different police agencies throughout the United States. Each one has their own policy for standards, training standards, and policing standards, records standards even. And they each answer to a state board. Each state has their own state board for policing or law enforcement. So you have 18,000 different teams playing by 50 different rule books.
Right.
Whereas, for example, in the county that I worked for, restricting somebody's airway was very clearly banned. Absolutely banned. For the last 20 years, it was taught that is not the correct way to do that. And the officer involved with the George Floyd case argued, oh, well, in Minneapolis, defensive tactics still teach that. So, we have one place in Virginia saying one thing, we have one place in Minneapolis teaching something else. And because of the very nature of law enforcement, it's localized. It's up to the states to control and to regulate their police agencies. There's no strong way to sort of pass a nationwide police reform law that would very very minutely regulate certain police actions, there's really no way to do that legally. So it's left up to the states.
Yeah.
And so that's where we see many states or many people are advocating within their state for those changes. And we're actually seeing those changes occur now. I think we're seeing more movement now than I think we ever have. And I think it's important that people get involved and they advocate for those changes.
That's a great segue to one of my next points then, is the states taking things into their, well, not taking it into their own hands. I mean, it's their job because, like you said, there is no national level. And I know a lot of people, the concept of a national police laws scares the living daylights out of a lot of people, because to them that's in a national police force, and that's, you know, a lot of people look at that as, you know, one step down the road toward fascism or one step toward horrible things. But by each state starting to look at the way they conduct their policing, that brings us to basically the concept of defunding the police, which is a trigger word if there ever was one. We'll be back with Matthew Newbauer to discuss defunding the police. Ooh. After this, stay tuned.
You'll be dead! You'll be dead like everybody else!
Would you still be her big soldier?
He ordered us to sterilize the women.
An entire agenda to wipe my bloodline from a nation because of who I am.
It's what you want to believe.
The award-winning film from Viking Dog Entertainment.
You destroyed their lives and I knew them! Admit you did it! I didn't do it!
I don't believe you. Are you an evil man? Or are you just a man who did evil things?
Truth. Available on streaming platforms, Blu-ray, and DVD. So why don't I let you explain, how does defunding the police really work? What does that really mean?
That's a great question, and I agree with you. It has become a trigger word. I think it's become politicized as well. Where we were talking before the interview about how different areas, different states are enforcing COVID regulations, and a lot of the verbiage around some of the things said is very politicized as well. And so with behind the very simple, and it's much more comprehensive and maybe a lot more detailed than this, but the basic sort of overarching understanding of defunding or police defunding is to reallocate for a local government to reallocate an amount of funds from police agencies to agencies in place to provide services for their jurisdiction.
Is such a misnomer then?
Yeah,
absolutely. It is
absolutely.
Such a misnomer.
Absolutely. I think some officers that I talk to, some are scared that there's going to be a reactionary response to just stripping a police budget of what's necessary for the police budget or police department to function. But from the cases that we've seen so far from very large police departments that have announced this defunding, we've namely, let's see, Denver, Colorado, Austin, Texas, for example, they are reallocating to agencies or creating agencies that are non-police agencies to answer calls for service that would normally fall to the police officer.
Thank you. That's exact. You're leading me right where I want to go. So that's exactly the point. Now there's a cartoon, and I actually sent it to you earlier today, and I think it's an amazing description of it, where it's a cartoon. This police officer has all of these weights on his back, and each one is like, I'll pull it up so I can actually describe it better. There we go. It's on my screen. It's all these boulders, and one says keep the peace, domestic violence, prostitution, school security, drug dealers, gang violence, drug possession, homelessness, unexpected crises. And there's these two people off to the side, And he goes, defund the police. How is he supposed to carry all that? And in the next panel, it shows all of those issues being taken care of by the proper organizations. And the guy is holding up a sign that says defund the police and says, exactly, he's not. And that's something that we don't talk about. Again, going back to my time when I was at the Chicago Tribune, one of the jobs, and I really hope they've changed this, but one of the jobs of police officers is to bring the bodies into the morgue. That's one of their jobs. So after they find a dead body in a walk, north side walk up, then it's their job to carry it down to the truck, take it to the morgue, the coroner's office, and drop it off. And they're doing, instead of doing their job. And the mental health that was starting to come up just from having to deal with these bodies was a whole issue. And I really hope they've changed that. But you have all of these jobs that we expect police officers to do that is not their job, down to like being the dog catcher. It's,
Absolutely.
And it's so, I understand the cuteness of the cat in the tree with the firemen and everything, but they should be out doing their job. So if we took these jobs and these other responsibilities and gave them to the right people who are trained to deal with them, it's going to make the job so much easier. And then it goes hand in hand with the reallocation. I'm going to start calling it what it is, reallocation of funds.
Yes.
That's what needs to happen.
And I would venture to say that there are very few experienced police officers there that would disagree or that want to deal with the things that they want to deal. I could tell you with that back when I was a patrol officer, say on a certain 10-hour shift, I would go from, stopping a vehicle for a traffic infraction to dealing with an accident where there could have been a serious injury or death. Then the very next call for service from that would be a mother calling to say that their 10-year-old refuses to get on the school bus and they want the police to do something about it. Going from that to a domestic violence call for service, and then going from that to a priority call for service of a suicidal person with a gun, all within the same exact shift, right? And the history of policing was really to maintain public order. It was kind of reactionary. If you look into the history of it, it's kind of reactionary to back in the Industrial Revolution towards the tail end when there were workers' union strikes, and the police were the arm of the government to say, come in and get back to work. And then after that, it became, after the Wickersham Commission of 1929, President Hoover he formed a commission because policing was so ineffective in 1929 that they needed to figure out what to do about it. And then that's when the sort of community policing model came out about being there and being part of the community and helping keep public order within a community. Well, culture changes, and I could tell you that in my career, from the beginning to the end, one of the largest areas of call for service for a patrol officer were mental health calls for service. And the average police officer, not only are they not trained or specialized in helping a person in a mental health crisis, say as a therapist or a social worker would be, but they don't necessarily want to be there either. What they want to do is just make sure everybody's safe and go home. Most police officers you talk to, they're going to want to clear that call for service as soon as possible because they're uncomfortable with dealing with something like that. Yeah. But the good news is in the reallocation of funds, now that we're calling it that, within the reallocation of funds movement, they're specifically around mental health calls for service that have come in. There has been a huge response of local agencies now making their own mental health response agency to help people that are struggling with mental health, mental illnesses, or a mental health diagnosis, or an actual mental health crisis, say suicidal ideation or whatnot. Where a good example is the department I used to work for, the Prince William County Police Department, started what was called a co-responder unit, where legally police officers have to respond to a call for service where somebody's safety may be in danger. So by law right now, police officers have to show up, but they have a special unit of specially trained police officers who get advanced training, who have a licensed social worker therapist that respond with them that take the lead, where they let the therapist take the lead. They're there for safety and scene security, but they let the therapist take the lead on connecting that person to the resources that they need. And we've seen that a model something like that in Denver, in Austin, in Pima County, Arizona, and Harris County, Texas, and it's been very, very successful so far. The only caveat that I have to say about the reallocation of funds is local governments need to take these agencies seriously, because there needs to be something in place to reallocate that money to, in order to properly serve the citizens of their community.
Or you're just going to be overloading another organization, and it's not going to have the funds or time. Yeah,
absolutely.
I've heard of those programs, the dual. I know other countries have tried them with great results as well. I've heard. So you hear that, and I hear it all the time, and I'll admit it, it really aggravates me, is these people who, you see the memes on social media and people going off about it, when they're like, well, how are you going to feel when a social worker shows up when there's a guy with a gun at your house? And it's like, that's not the argument. It's not like they're just gonna, the dispatcher's gonna hop on and be like, report of man with gun at 300 North Main Street. Yeah, send the social worker. That's not how it works.
Correct.
Correct.
But the way that it does work is okay, well, what happens to that guy after you talk him into a safe setting? Once the gun is taken away, what happens to him then? What's the reason that he pulled the gun in the first place? What is the mental health crisis this guy is going through that makes him feel like he has to resort to a deadly weapon to be heard? That's the type of holistic response that communities really deserve to have, especially people in our communities that have mental health diagnoses, which 1 in 4, I think, was the most recent. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men, I think, are diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis. And so, to be able to properly serve our communities, we have to be able to have those types of agencies in place. That's my firm belief.
No, yeah, and I think that goes hand in hand with the changes that we're seeing for low-lying drug offenses. That 21 years in prison for selling marijuana or getting caught with a joint. Did you know the very, very first person? And this is what I was told when I was a reporter. And I like my editor used to say, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. But the story that I was told was Chicago was one of the first cities in the country to put in CCTV cameras all over the city. And the very first guy who got busted worked at a factory, and he went out to his car after his shift ended, lit up a joint, and he was the first guy to get busted by that camera. And these kind of offenses, if we're getting to a point now where we've legalized marijuana in most growing number of states, we realize it's not a criminal thing. Somebody doesn't smoke a joint and go out and knock over, a bank. So that's changing. So we have to change the prosecution and the judicial system and how we're going after that. It's the same thing with what you said, a guy who has a gun and is suicidal, or what's the underlying problem? Not just, okay, lock him up for 20 years. It's like, okay, well, it could be a mental issue. It could be a drug problem. It could be anything, or it could be criminal intent. But we need to figure out what it is and deal with that versus just locking away and throwing away the key and have the largest penal system in the world and forget and wonder why we have a problem. So there's my little moment. It's my show. I get to say it.
Well, that's a good. You bring up about the criminal justice system and reform within the system itself. Not just policing. Policing is a huge part of that, but the whole system itself really needs reform. I want to give you a quick example, if that's okay. Do we have time for me to give you? Okay.
We have all the time. It's my show. Talk away.
There we go. Okay. So I want to give an example of sort of how we've sort of gotten to the place that we've gotten. And again, if you have any police officers listening, both current and former, I believe that they'll be able to relate to this. So let's take a look at real quick. Let's talk about the history of modern policing. The very sort of condensed version is in the last 40 years, there was a statistics-based policing, right? So where there was more criminal activity happening, more police officers were sent to those areas, right? And there's a theory, very basic policing 101 theory called the broken windows theory, that if you let somebody break out a window, there's going to be a second broken window, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an argument for zero tolerance policies, right? So you have very strict zero tolerance policies in areas where there are more reported crimes or criminal activity, more proactive policing happening in that, which means that there's more police officers having more interactions with people within those areas, right? Those areas have been disproportionately impoverished, and areas where it's been mostly people of color. And the more police interactions, the more arrests happen, right? So it's not just that there's all this criminal action happening, that there's an impoverished area and police are saturating that area and stopping everybody and anything that they can, whether it's, public spitting, loitering, things like that.
Yep.
Well, out in the suburban communities, there's been all over the country that there's been a sort of a version of this, I guess you could say. There's been a version of this type of policing where, for example, say there's a person that lives in one of these poor communities, they have a car, and say their windshield got cracked. Well, it's the law, in traffic law, you're not allowed to drive a car with a cracked windshield. And at some point, you're going to have to get that car inspected. In order to drive it. In most states, they have an inspection. Well, your car won't pass inspection if you have a cracked windshield, right? So then we get this person driving this car with a cracked windshield. They get pulled over and they get given a ticket for having a cracked windshield. What happens then? Well, now on top of having to fix their cracked windshield, they now have a fine that they're going to have to pay. Well, if they can't afford the windshield to be fixed, you really think they're going to be able to pay for this ticket that they're given? Well, what happens? Well, eventually this person either pays the ticket, or more often than not, they either forget about it or say, on my list of priorities, feeding my kids is more important than paying this ticket. And then they end up getting their licenses suspended. Most states have a law that if you have court fines or unpaid tickets, they will suspend your license. Well, now they're driving around with a suspended license, and then they get pulled over for driving on a suspended license, and then they get arrested for driving on a suspended license. Now they are now have an arrest on their record. There's really no defense to that except they couldn't pay the ticket, and now they have this driving offense on their record where their license can be suspended for even longer. Well, that person needs to get to work. That person needs to help family members. That person needs to take care of their kids. Are they just going to stop driving? No, because we live in a society, most suburban areas, you have to drive. And then they're going to get pulled over again and again. And many states, they have it's like a 3 strikes rule for driving on a suspended license, that after the 3rd conviction, driving on a suspended license is a felony. Now we're making people felons for not being able to afford to fix the things that they need to fix on their car, and having to prioritize, wait, do I pay the light bill? Do I buy my kids food, or do I get this car fixed, or try to get my license back? And that is an example. Virginia passed a sweeping police reform measure in the last 12 months, the Commonwealth of Virginia, where they actually made it a secondary offense for police officers when it comes to, which means that they can't pull over somebody just for this issue. They have to have a traffic moving violation to pull somebody over. So, for example, they can't just pull people over for dark tint or a cracked windshield or an inspection that's less than 4 months out of inspection. Same thing for registration, loud muffler, noise violations, and things like that. They can't pull. They don't have the authority anymore to pull a car over for those things without having a moving violation like speeding, running a stop sign, and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so that is sort of one example of how, at least in the Commonwealth of Virginia, they're trying to address these issues of issues that mainly affect people that that live in poor communities or impoverished communities. And more often than not are people of color that are also affected by implicit biases. So it's the whole system has to be reformed. It's one thing to say, okay, well, we're going to reallocate funds to a service. That's great, but that's a start. It has to be more than just that. It has to be looking at legislative changes and politicians that are going to support those legislative changes in order to give a community the type of services that they are entitled to, that they have the right to as tax-paying citizens of a community.
This episode of the Open Highway Podcast is brought to you by absolutely nobody. If you are interested in sponsoring the show or advertising on the program, drop us a line at openhighwaypodcast@gmail.com. We're doing an interesting thing here. We're going through, we have identified, the judicial system needs to be looked at, reformed. The criminal system needs to be reformed. The training system needs to be reformed. The interaction with community needs to be reformed. And that's, I am oversimplifying that, and I completely admit that. What about the disciplinary system? What about the way that officers are held responsible for their actions? The claim that ignorance is, I didn't know, or that's how I was trained, or basically that they were in the wrong. The FOP is incredibly powerful, the Fraternal Order of Police. The way that these cases are handled quite often is very ham-handed, and I think is the correct term, the correct legal term, ham-fisted, whatever it is. But often it's very clunky. Body cameras, well, we can't release that, or there's a wall is set up. Often the chief of police is automatically asked to resign, and it's like, well, let's figure out what happened. Let's they take the fall for something that may be their fault, may have been their predecessor's fault, may not have been involved at all. But how can we change that aspect of the problem?
That is such a great question. And this goes back to talking about the 18,000 different police agencies that we have. You have 18,000 different local communities that have agreements with their either the union that represents their first responders, or in right-to-work states that don't have unions, the Fraternal Order of Police or local police associations and whatnot. Specifically with unions, the unions help the police officers, and usually if it's a union, it's first responders, but let's take the police unions. They are the ones that negotiate the contracts that these cities and counties have with the police departments. And so within those contracts there are agreements for everything from disciplinary proceedings to pay raises to mandatory overtime if there is, all sorts of things.
There's rules about physicals, about whether or not they have to actually, not be overweight. I mean,
absolutely,
it's crazy.
Yeah, and it changes. It changes from state to state and from community to community. And so the binding contract that a city or county enters in with the police union that are advocating on the behalf of these police officers, that becomes the rule book that the city or the county has to follow. And so there are many places where a police officer is accused of wrongdoing, and there is a lengthy and arduous process by which to adjudicate whatever that wrongdoing is. And the city legally can't just fire an officer. They just can't.
You're not kidding about the rule book. There's a little white book. And I'm letting everybody know that, like, when I was a reporter, we had a copy. Each reporter had a copy of the white FOP book, and it's actually made to fit into the pocket of the uniform of the police officers. It's actually the exact same size as, it's about the size of like an old Gideon Bible. It's a little bit wider, but it's actually fit. and you open it up and it's got every rule in that the union has, and we would have to, we had our own copy, because every time there was a police shooting, or every time there was an officer disciplinary action, whatever, as a reporter, we had to open up that book and be like, okay, how are they going to respond to this? What is
Absolutely.
It was insane. So I just wanted to point out, you're not kidding. There's a literal rule book.
There's literal rule books. Absolutely. There are. And they're all binding agreements. Fun little fact for you. I was part of a police union when I was a police officer in New Hampshire. And my union was the Teamsters Union, a certain local Teamsters union that was represented by Jimmy Hoffa III. Jimmy Hoffa III was the president of the union.
There's just something
so
cinematic about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And but some states are their right to work states. For example, Virginia, up until they just changed it, was a right to work state where police departments or any employer could just fire somebody for any reason. That's a simplified version. And so the whole idea of having unions for the police, or having the Fraternal Order of Police represent the police, is to make sure that police officers as employees get a fair shake when it comes to working conditions, and for example, if they're being accused of something, that it's a fair adjudication of what that is. However, some of these unions are very powerful. And you'll see spokespeople for these unions go on to CNN or Fox News and actually do interviews based off of police actions that they were not there for, have no idea who's in the. Okay, great example is Eric Garner, who was killed in, I believe it was in Brooklyn a few years back. He was selling loose cigarettes, and he was killed by New York City police officers, a plainclothes unit in New York City. Shortly after that, the leader of the police union for NYPD did a press conference and said, "We fully support the officers. They did nothing wrong." They have no idea. They absolutely have no idea what happened. They're not privy to the information. And then when these local a great example is there have been cases where local governments decide that they're going to criminally charge their own. And when that happens, the police union comes out swinging and says that, this is an affront to the decency of all police officers, blah, blah, blah. And that political weight is really what controls the narrative.
Yes.
In that. And so in my opinion, it's a very long, complex and nuanced conversation on how you overcome that. But I think the first step to take in something like that is to talk to your local officials on, what are these agreements that as a taxpaying citizen, I want to know what agreements the city or the county that represents me is going in, to and agreeing to, and then advocating for change.
Are those, and I'm honestly asking because I don't know, because every state's different. Like you said, there's 18,000 different ones. So are those negotiations open? Because in some states, those are closed door negotiations, and the public is not allowed to know what the negotiations were because of labor laws or whatever. So are they, or are they not?
So in many of them, they are, you're right, they're closed, but they still have to be ratified by the governing body, whether it's a board of county supervisors or town or city council, et cetera. It still has to be ruled on by a majority vote and then signed off on by the city attorney, the county attorney, et cetera.
So then it's going to be the power of the vote later on, voting those people out of office because they didn't like the negotiations that they approved.
Absolutely. And we live in a time right now where it's a double-edged sword. Social media is very much a double-edged sword. However, we live in a time where people can advocate for change and be heard all over the world. That's something that we haven't seen something like that within policing outside of the modern age, save for a couple of issues like the Kent State shootings, and again, we brought up Rodney King. But so we live it in a time now where that can be publicized, where people can raise awareness for what's going on within their specific community. And and advocate for their community and advocate for pressure. I could tell you that the public information office of a local, say a small town or a small city is not going to want their the New York, affiliate for NBC calling and saying, we're doing a story on what's happening, And again, the politics and perception is everything to these local communities. And so it's advocating for that, advocating for change in the hiring practices, advocating for change in the contracts, and then advocating for training and for our police departments out there to make sure that these guys are getting the proper training. Public trust is what's necessary for effective policing. You have to have public trust. How do you get public trust? By being transparent and showing the people that you serve that you are serving their best interests, right? And the best way for these places to be comfortable with their transparency is to have uniform standards. And that's what's necessary to ensure that these changes or policies are being fair to all, both the local government, the police officers, and the community at large.
That's such a tough balance. I mean, it's required, it but it's like it's similar in many ways, I think, to the education issue. They tried, No Child Left Behind. They tried to come up with standards and minimums for the country, and we're still trying to figure that out, and it's not working. But Absolutely. Each state doesn't want, they don't want a national standard, and look what's happened with it. But that's a whole other show. There's one more topic I would like to talk about, because I think it's only fair, but two, I think it's important. We talked a lot about the problems and the bad apples and the bad training, and we all know that there's police officers became cops because they were the bully in high school, or they just want it's a fact. Anyone can argue the percentage the day is long. There's some people that say it's 100%. There's some people that say it's 1. That's it doesn't matter. That's a national debate that will go on till the end of time. But I think it's important. Like, you brought up an interesting thing, that you were on the rape task force when in your experience, and you had some different areas that you worked in, and those had to take a toll on you as a police officer and a human being. And I think that we need to recognize that. I know we have PTSD counselors for police officers. I mean, after 9/11 was a great example, that we know that they worked with them how to get through this, through the losses, through the violence, or not the situation. How do we make sure that it may sound overly dramatic, but if you have enough bad things happen to somebody, it can start to change their personality. It can start to change the way they look at the world. It can start to change the way they treat their fellow man. So how do we take care of them and also address these needs? And there's also an issue within law enforcement, and I saw it when I was dealing with them, not just in Chicago, but other cities where I was a reporter. There is this, like, I can deal with anything kind of, attitude. Like, I don't need no counselor. It's there's that mentality of, I'll just go home and have a stiff whiskey and I'll be okay. Or, or drink of choice, or whatever it is. How do we address that? How do we give them the help that they need, even if they don't know that they need it?
That is a great. So I'm very passionate about the subject. I'm involved with a charity out in Wisconsin called Responders Retreat, which is specifically for police officers, paramedics, and firefighters that are going through work-related post-traumatic stress incidents or injuries. Sorry, post-traumatic stress injuries, where it might not be a disorder yet, but they're definitely injured. And they need some time to decompress. So, I think you are absolutely right. It's a very stressful job. There are so many different, calls for service that involve things that really are the most traumatic to the person, not just the officer showing up, right? So I always say that nobody really meets a police officer when they're having a good time, right? When they're having a good day, and so there's usually something involved with that, especially I could say with our the crash investigators that I worked with, that their job was to investigate fatal collisions. So for those guys, for back when I was in our Special Victims Bureau dealing with cases of crimes against children, and there is absolutely trauma that officers they encounter and they experience, and many officers will self-medicate with alcohol, like you said, because it's legal, right? And something else besides alcohol is by far the largest method of self-medication. After that, it has been prescription medication for officers that have experienced some type of physical injury and the inevitable addiction that follows that. And so we also see some of the highest divorce rates of any job within law enforcement, and also dealing with people that might not necessarily like you or want you there, or people that want to hurt you. I know I've been there, and I've been injured myself, and it's a scary experience. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing a light that is shining now on these issues. The agency that I worked with, granted, is very progressive. Most agencies aren't like this, but a few years ago, over a very short period of time, I lost 4 different coworkers within like a 2-year period. 4 coworkers to suicide, and these were all investigators. They weren't patrol cops. They weren't the school resource guys. They were guys that I worked with every day. And after that, we started, looking into, okay, well, what can we do? So my agency started looking into peer support programs, but then also trauma-informed therapists. And so when I was a part of my Special Victims Bureau, I actually had to go and see a therapist it was twice a year when I had to do it. I think it's every 3 months for them now to talk about stuff. And most guys would say, oh, I'm just going to show up. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to sit there for my 30 minutes and leave. And there's not much that you can do about that. But what you can do is start to destigmatize these issues around mental health. And I instructed a lot of classes where we did just that. And I would always compare it to, hey, if you sprained your ankle, would you be out there, running to go catch a bad guy? No, you wouldn't, because your ankle's sprained. You'd be on desk duty, making sure that you're healing. So you're good enough to be out there, because, a hurt police officer isn't going to be good to the community. It's not going to be good to yourself, and you're not going to get the suspect. It's just, it doesn't make sense. And so starting to destigmatize that, which is really on the onus of the leadership of these departments to do. And it's absolutely necessary if we want healthy police officers serving our communities, dealing with mental health and finding ways to encourage and help these officers that are experiencing these traumatic events. For being able to destigmatize and offer some type of service to them is absolutely necessary.
Wouldn't you say that? I'm not putting words in your mouth, but wouldn't you say? But it's.
Sound like a journalist.
I don't have an editor to answer to, so I don't have to follow Paul Zimbracos anymore. I know I've run into police officers and military people as well, MPs and some other guys, and I'll say they're men. It's always men, and they have the attitude that if they admit that there's this part of their job that's getting to them, or that they're suffering from this, that's weakness. And the weakness will then manifest itself in the way that they do their job. Yeah. And they will be in danger, because they are not of that warrior mentality that they need to be when they're out in the field or on the street or in the patrol car. That seems like that's part of the problem. And it seems to be the older generations. I haven't dealt with a lot of the next gen that's come up in the law enforcement, so I can't speak to that. But definitely there is that, I'll call it what it is, that kind of John Wayne mentality where it's just, and I love John Wayne, but it's that mentality. It's like it will start to eat away at me because it will become true. How do you fight that? I mean,
yeah, that's part of the destigmatizing, and also educating police leadership to make sure that they appropriately respond to those issues. The biggest excuse that I've heard from police officers is, I don't want them to take my batching gun. I want to be able to do my job. I've been doing this job. I like this job. I feel like I'm helping people. I don't want that taken away from me. Part of it is many officers, and I hate this, where they make their entire identity their job, and that's unhelpful in itself. That's unhelpful. But let's stick to mental health. There are ways for police leadership to destigmatize those issues, so that when somebody's having a hard time, that they're not afraid that they're going to get their authority taken away from them, or the position that they really like taken away from them, but they're going to be afforded an opportunity to be able to try to right whatever that stressor is. One thing that I've worked hard with the charity that I mentioned is to we're trying to work with agencies that if a person has suffered from a post-traumatic stress injury, for them to be able to go on a week-long training, gets billed as training to we call it stress management training, where really it's trauma-informed therapists and psychologists that volunteer their time to come and help teach these trauma or stress-reducing trauma treatment for these officers. A lot of it, you're right, the new generation has grown up with the stigma around mental health sort of dropping a bit. It's decreased quite a bit since I started, and that's a good thing. But it's sort of continuing on with that momentum into the whole, I guess, the big subject of law enforcement in general. I'll share a personal story with you about that. So my favorite job that I had in my career was investigating crimes against children. I specifically specialized with chronic sexual abuse of children. And I had a tremendous track record of being able to get prosecutions and convictions on delayed disclosure cases. For example, something happened to, say, a kid when they were 5 or 6, and now they're 18 or 19, and it's just coming out now. There's a very special way to investigate those. And I was tremendously successful at that. I was doing that for a while. I was working 60, 70 hours a week, normally, not to mention, working, over and above that, working sometimes 48 hours at a time, from beginning to end if I had an important case, because in my mind, if I wasn't there, who was going to help these kids, right? Who was going to be there for them? And one day I was heading to work, and I started to have chest pains. And I'm like you, I like to work out. I exercise every day, and I started to have chest pains. And I'm like, well, I'm healthy. Like, what's going on? And I thought I was having a heart attack. And I pulled over on the side of the road, in my unmarked police squad car, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, is this it? Is this really how I'm going to go? And then after about 10 minutes, it went away. And I called my wife, and I told her, and she was like, oh, I think you're stressed. I think you just need to take a few days off. And I told her, I can't take a few days off. Like, what's going to happen to my cases? I have to be there for these kids. I have to be there. And the following day on the way to work, it happened again. And then the third day, it happened again. So bad where, it hurt so bad. I legitimately thought I was having some type of heart issue. And I called a friend of mine who works in the medical field. And I'm like, hey, listen, like, this is what's going on. Like, is there any way that a healthy guy can have some type of heart issue? And she told me, she goes, no, you're having a panic attack. And I was like, well, no, I'm not panicked about anything. I'm in control, And she's like, no, you're having a panic attack. You need to go talk to somebody about this. And she goes, I know what you do. Like, you need to talk to somebody. And my wife started echoing that same thing. She had seen, all the signs of dealing with somebody that is overly stressed. She had seen that. I just was disconnected when I came home. And she had mentioned this, but I just thought, no, I'm just busy. She just doesn't understand. And so finally, I sat down with my wife, and I was like, I need to do something about this. She goes, well, you need to transfer out of that union. It's too much stress right now for you. You need to go somewhere that's healthy. And I thought, that's the worst the worst idea I've ever heard in my life. This is what I like to do. I'm not going to do that. And she was like, well, there's quite a bit of trauma that you experienced that both as a child and then as an adult dealing with these issues. But there's a lot of trauma that's unresolved that you need to look at. And I'm like, no, I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine. And it got so bad. One day, my wife, she called me. I was at work after we had discussed a little bit. She goes, Matt, you need to talk to your supervisor today about transferring. I was like, I'm not going to do that. She goes, well, either you talk to your supervisor or I'm going to.
Whoa.
I'm like, no, you wouldn't do that. No, absolutely not. And so she's like, okay, well, I'll give you till lunch. And then after lunch, she called me and she goes, hey, did you call your supervisor and talk to them yet? I'm like, no, I told you I'm not going to do that. And then about an hour later, my supervisor calls me into her office and she says, hey, I got a call from your wife. Let's talk. And that was the hardest conversation that I've ever had. And my department was very good about it. I took some days off and then I transferred to a different unit. And although I felt like I was losing something that I loved, I was gaining my family back, and I was gaining my own sense of self back as well.
Wow.
I had the Superman complex, that, somebody else is going to be able to fill in that, that need. Somebody else is going to be able to do the investigation. Like, everything's going to be okay. But most important is myself and my family, and to make sure we're all okay. And luckily, I was in a department that prioritized that because of the loss that we had. And a lot of departments, they have to get on board with that. A lot of these agencies need to get on board with introducing some type of mental health, training and, policies for how to deal with somebody going through a mental health crisis at work, because that's not safe for anybody, for the officer or for the people that they deal with.
Yeah. That personal story is such a great way to end this, I think. It's because I think that ties up the personal aspect of it, and just an amazing way to show all the entire conversation that we've had. So first of all, thanks for sharing that. I think it's really important. You're very lucky. You should go buy your wife some flowers, multiple flowers or whatever she wants. New Mercedes. But I have had just an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for spending all this time with me. I think we really covered a lot of great topics, and I don't think we solved anything, but I think definitely it was interesting to get a lot of those ideas out there. And I think a lot of things we touched on, people are afraid to even talk about. And I really hope that whoever's listening in the audience will think twice about spouting off about something before actually thinking about it, and maybe have a conversation about it. So Matthew Newbauer, thank you so much. And you don't have a book to pitch.
I don't. I'm just passionate about this.
Next time you have a book, let me know. We'll shill it.
Sounds good.
Matt, thanks so much. Thanks, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time.
And that's it for this episode of The Open Highway. Thanks again to Matt Newbauer for having that conversation on modern policing. It really gets you thinking. It's not a simple topic, but we can definitely see things that we can start working on. Doesn't matter who you are, whether you are outside of the policing system or inside of it. Let's acknowledge the issues and start having that conversation. So thank you for joining me on the first episode of The Open Highway. If you want to reach out to us, openhighwaypodcast@gmail.com. Send your comments, send your suggestions. Love to hear from you. And look forward to coming back with our next episode in the future. We have some amazing conversations on gender issues, Native American culture, climate change. We have some special guests that you are really, really going to enjoy coming on future episodes. So thanks for coming on this journey. It's feeling good to stretch my journalistic muscles once again, and already thinking about how I can improve the show, improve the conversations. So I hope you enjoyed this. Look forward to talking to you guys again. I'll see you on the open highway. Thanks, everybody. The Open Highway is a production of Viking Dog Entertainment. Check us out at vikingdogentertainment.com and on Instagram at VikingDogENT.